In the aftermath of World War II, the fate of Germany's once feared fleet of submarines, U-boats, was sealed in a new geopolitical and economic reality. The surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945, marked the formal end of the conflict in Europe, but for the German U-boat fleet, the war's end did not mean an immediate cessation of significance. Instead, it set in motion a complex and gradual process of evaluation, repurposing, and destruction. The fate of these submarines would be shaped by the priorities of the victorious Allies, the immediate post-war political landscape, and the immense logistical pressures faced by each occupying power. What followed for the U-boats was a quiet story of surplus, obsolescence, and historical loss. At the time of the German surrender, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was left with approximately 1,100 submarines of varying sizes and capabilities. These submarines had been a central element in Germany's naval strategy, their efforts to disrupt Allied shipping a key aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic. However, by May 1945, the tide of the war had decisively turned. The Allies had developed countermeasures to mitigate the U-boat threat, and the growing dominance of Allied air and naval forces had rendered many of these submarines obsolete. The Allied powers, now in control of the territories where these U-boats were stationed, Germany itself, as well as France, Norway, and the Netherlands, faced the task of managing these naval assets in a new world order. Initially, the priority for the Allies was to prevent the remaining U-boats from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union, who had gained control over much of Eastern Europe and were expanding their influence in the post-war period. As a result, several submarines were scuttled by the Germans themselves in an attempt to deny them to the advancing Allied forces. The German surrender was not instantaneous in its execution, and as the Allies moved through the occupied territories, they found the U-boats in varying states. Some fully operational, others in the process of being sabotaged by their own crews, and many still docked in major naval bases. In the immediate aftermath of the war, an inspection of these submarines became necessary. The Allies quickly recognized the strategic value of capturing intact U-boats, both for intelligence purposes and for their potential to bolster naval operations. The British, American, and French navies took the lead in the assessment, but there was no unified strategy. The sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. Thousands of U-boat crews had either been captured or had surrendered. Most of the submarines were docked in naval bases along the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, where they had been stationed during the final months of the war. Some U-boats had been scuttled by their crews in port, but many others remained afloat, albeit in various stages of disrepair. The British were among the first to begin actively inspecting the submarines they captured. Their approach was methodical, focusing primarily on gathering intelligence. U-boats such as the U-530 and U-1001, both still operational at the time of their capture, were taken to Britain for further inspection. These submarines offered the British Navy an invaluable opportunity to examine the technological advancements of the Kriegsmarine. They were especially interested in the German innovations in submarine design, particularly the use of snorkels, advanced radar systems, and silent propulsion mechanisms. These technical insights would later influence the development of post-war Allied submarines. However, it was not long before the limitations of this large fleet became apparent. Many of the U-boats that survived the war were simply no longer needed. The shift in naval tactics and the Allied dominance of the oceans meant that these once prized vessels were now largely redundant. The global shipping routes, which had been under constant threat from the U-boats during the war, were now secure, and the need for submarines as a strategic weapon had diminished. Economic pressures added to the urgency of dealing with the surplus. The vast number of U-boats presented significant logistical and financial burdens for the occupying forces. These vessels were expensive to maintain and repair, and the war-ravaged economies of Europe had little to no room for such extravagances. Moreover, the high cost of salvaging or repurposing them, especially in light of the growing tension between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, was simply untenable. The majority of these submarines had limited operational usefulness in the new political context. It became increasingly clear that the U-boats, despite their potential historical value, were no longer a priority for the Allies. Initially, a few of the submarines were earmarked for further use, either as training vessels or for testing new weapon systems, but these plans were short-lived. The dismantling process soon began, and the fate of the U-boats was sealed as a long, drawn-out process of scrapping, repurposing, or abandonment. For example, the U-boats that had been captured by the British began a systematic process of decommissioning. At the Royal Navy's Portsmouth dockyard, U-boats were stripped of their valuable parts, such as the advanced sonar systems and radar equipment. Much of the metal that could be salvaged was recycled, and the remaining hulls were either sunk or left to rot. However, a small number of submarines, particularly those considered to be in better condition, were put to more direct use. The U-boat U-234, which had been one of the most advanced submarines in the German fleet, was a notable exception. After being captured by the Americans, it was initially taken to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for further inspection. The U-234 had a unique place in history due to its cargo, which included advanced German technology, as well as a group of Japanese officers. It was hoped that this vessel could provide critical intelligence on both German and Japanese wartime innovations. However, after its inspection, the submarine was deemed unnecessary and was subsequently scrapped, a fate that awaited many of its counterparts. Meanwhile, in France, the Vichy regime had been a collaborator with Nazi Germany, and their harbor facilities were also filled with captured U-boats. The French initially showed interest in keeping several U-boats in operational service, but the financial constraints of a post-war economy struggling to recover quickly made this impractical. Like their British counterparts, the French were forced to scrap most of the submarines, a process that was slow and costly. By the late 1940s, the once dominant U-boat fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its original size, most either dismantled or lying abandoned in foreign harbors. While the major Allied powers had their hands full dealing with the immediate logistical and political challenges of post-war Europe, the Soviet Union had a different interest in the captured U-boats. Although they did manage to seize a number of these submarines, particularly in areas of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was less interested in the technological aspects and more focused on the potential symbolic value of the U-boats. The Soviets kept a few of the submarines as trophies, displaying them at naval exhibitions, but the majority were scrapped or left to decay. The sheer volume of captured U-boats and the dwindling interest in maintaining them was staggering. By the early 1950s, it was estimated that over 90% of the German U-boat fleet had been dismantled, repurposed, or simply left to rot in port. The fate of the submarines, once the vanguard of German naval power, was not one of glory, but one of quiet decline. The post-war disposal of Germany's U-boats continued into the early 1950s, and as the world settled into the uneasy peace of the Cold War, the overwhelming majority of these once feared submarines were either scrapped, abandoned, or repurposed for far less significant roles. The fate of the captured German U-boats highlights the difficulty of maintaining a fleet of such magnitude in an era of economic strain, shifting political alliances, and changing naval tactics. While some submarines found new lives in various forms, the vast majority of them faded into obscurity, their historical significance overshadowed by practical, economic, and strategic realities. For the Allied powers, the main concern was the cost of maintaining the U-boats in any capacity. Initially, the idea of repurposing them for scientific research or intelligence gathering seemed appealing, but these ambitions quickly dissolved in the face of overwhelming logistical challenges. The American Navy, for instance, initially considered keeping a few U-boats for testing advanced anti-submarine warfare techniques, but the effort proved more expensive than expected. The resources required to keep the vessels operational simply could not be justified in the wake of a war that had drained the nation's economy. The economic costs of maintaining and operating these vessels were significant. In the aftermath of the war, both Britain and France struggled with rebuilding their economies. The U-boats themselves represented an enormous financial burden. By the time their fate was sealed in the early 1950s, the majority of these vessels were effectively useless, obsolete in an era where new technological advancements, especially in the realm of nuclear-powered submarines, were quickly making older models irrelevant. Furthermore, the Cold War arms race had already begun, and with it came the development of newer, more advanced naval technologies. The U-boat, a product of World War II, was simply no longer a relevant asset in this new geopolitical landscape. The British, in particular, faced an overwhelming task in dealing with the large number of captured U-boats in their possession. In the first few years following the war, a considerable number of these submarines were inspected, stripped of their valuable parts, and then sold for scrap. The parts that could be salvaged were often sold to private industries or used to replenish the Royal Navy's own equipment. However, the sheer scale of the disposal process meant that much of the remaining material was either sunk or left to rust in harbors. The British government's decision to scrap most of the captured U-boats was, in part, a response to the pressing need for rebuilding the national economy. While the submarines could have provided valuable insights into German technology, the economic reality of post-war Britain made it clear that the costs far outweighed any potential benefits. For the United States, the decision to scrap most of the German U-boats was more practical than ideological. The U.S. Navy had its sights set on the future, and the German submarines, with their outdated designs, simply did not fit into that vision. However, a few exceptions remained. The most notable example of American interest in a German U-boat was the U-234. This submarine had been carrying an important cargo of advanced technology and a small group of Japanese officers at the time of its surrender. Its capture and subsequent examination were of considerable interest to the United States, as it provided valuable insights into the technological advancements of both the Germans and the Japanese. However, after initial investigations, the U-234 was also deemed unnecessary for further service and was eventually scrapped. While many of the U-boats were consigned to scrap yards, others were subjected to a different fate. A small number were kept as museum pieces or used as training vessels. These remaining submarines were sometimes displayed in naval museums, where they served as stark reminders of the war's devastating reach. In some cases, the submarines were used as training platforms for new sailors, teaching them basic procedures and tactics in submarine operation. However, these uses were limited, and by the 1960s, the last of the captured U-boats had been retired or dismantled. The French, too, faced similar challenges in dealing with the captured U-boats. While France had an interest in using some of these submarines for their own naval programs, the financial difficulties of post-war France made this impractical. The country's war-torn economy simply could not afford to maintain a fleet of German submarines. By the late 1940s, most of the captured U-boats had been scrapped, and only a few remained as static displays either in museums or naval training facilities. In Germany, the country's own post-war naval strategy was undergoing a transformation. Following its defeat, Germany was forbidden by the Allies from maintaining a significant military force, including a navy. The U-boats, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were now remnants of a defeated power. The few remaining U-boats in German possession were either scrapped or left abandoned in harbors. However, this did not mark the complete end of the German submarine legacy. In the early 1950s, with the beginning of the Cold War, West Germany was rearmed under the auspices of NATO, and the Bundesmarine, Federal Navy, was established. While the new German Navy would not inherit the old U-boats, they would build their own fleet, using modern technology that made the wartime U-boats entirely irrelevant. As the years went on, the narrative surrounding the German U-boats shifted from one of military power to one of historical curiosity. By the 1970s, few people were even aware of the full extent of the post-war fate of the U-boat fleet. The few remaining submarines that had survived the scrapping process were largely relegated to museums or forgotten in naval yards, their historical importance gradually eroded by time. However, some would endure longer in public memory, such as U-505, a German submarine captured by the U.S. Navy in 1944, which was eventually preserved and is now on display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The scrapping of the U-boat fleet, though an inevitable consequence of post-war circumstances, remains a quiet tragedy in the broader context of World War II's legacy. These submarines, which had once posed such a significant threat to Allied shipping, now met their end in an era where they had little place. The massive scale of their destruction, tens of thousands of tons of steel, machinery, and technology, was a direct result of the immense economic pressure that the post-war world placed on the victors. Their loss, while not as dramatic as the battles fought during the war, was equally final. For many of the U-boats, their end came not in a fiery explosion or a heroic last stand, but through the dull, mechanical processes of dismantling. The cold, methodical work of scrapping, of cutting these submarines apart and turning them into scrap metal, mirrored the larger process of post-war reconstruction. The U-boats, once symbols of Nazi Germany's power and aggression, were reduced to lifeless hulls, useless and forgotten in the face of changing technological and political realities. Today, the fate of the German U-boat fleet is a reflection of the broader theme of the post-war world: how the remnants of war are handled, how military technology becomes obsolete, and how even the most formidable instruments of war can be swept away in the pursuit of a new, often more uncertain peace. The U-boats may no longer threaten the seas, but their story remains one of the great, quiet tragedies of the post-war period. They were not destroyed by a final, heroic battle, but by the cold, indifferent logic of economic necessity and the relentless march of time.